Okay, so what we're doing right now is we are going to be looking at a review, and the review handout that you have has been posted in Teams, and so I want you to take a look at that. And so on the handout on Teams that we're looking at, we're going to be just kind of filling out some information that we should be familiarizing ourselves with. And this is going to be called Unit 3 Review A, because we're going to review a little bit more on Monday and have a test on Tuesday. But one of the things that we've been talking about, a question of this unit, has been how do land-based empires gain and maintain power? And our time frame is from 1450 to 1750. And for number one of the ways that they gain and maintain power, or one of the issues we need to talk about is number one, how they consolidated power. How they consolidated power. We'll talk about that in this unit. And also number two, how they legitimized their power, how they legitimized their power. So these are the two themes that we'll be talking about and that we'll be addressing. A couple of areas that we'll be talking about, you might remember that we talked about various land-based empires in this unit. And one of the land-based empires we talked about in China was the Qing dynasty. That's Qing, the Qing dynasty in China. And in South Asia, which is like modern day India, whenever we talk about AP world, we talk about South Asia, we're looking at India. The region that we have identified in South Asia, which is India, is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire. That's Mughal. Now, also, we talked about another Muslim empire which controlled the Middle East. It controlled North Africa. It controlled Southeastern Europe. And that empire was referred to as the Ottoman Empire. And so these are a third example of a major land-based empire. We also talked about another Middle Eastern empire. This one controlled mainly the Middle Eastern region of modern-day Iran. This was an empire that was actually different from their Muslim neighbors, because this was the only major example of a Shia empire. And this Middle Eastern empire, mainly in Iran, was the Safavid. The Safavid. We also had very briefly a West African empire we talked about. Now, typically when we talk about West Africa, we've talked about the country, the nation of Mali, which is Mali, of course, but this is another one that was along that same region, and they were called the Songhai, which is Songhai, the Songhai. So FYI, those are the regions in general that we've kind of talked about. Now, one of the ways that empires consolidate their power is by, number one, it says, by centralizing a bureaucracy. Now, we've used that word bureaucracy many times, and basically, you know that these bureaucracies are trained government workers. That's what a bureaucracy is. If you work in the bureaucracy, you are a trained government worker. And the thing about this is that these trained government workers really carry out the will of the government. They carry out the will of the government, and not only the general desire and will of the government, but also on a practical level, it helps the government collect things like taxes. So if I want to have an empire, I need to have people to help run the empire, people who are administrators, people who are part of the bureaucracy. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. For example, in China, you might remember that they use this method to make sure all of their government workers are on the same page. If you wanted to work for the government, for letter A, you had to use what was called the civil service exam. And the civil service exam helped promote a way, the, the civil service exam promoted a way to think and to believe the same things. The civil service exam promoted a way to think and believe the same things, because basically if you work for the government, you're going to have to like get into Confucianism to get a job. And so this is a really good way for China to make sure that the workers that they have are going to be like on the same page. And that was really important because one of those dynasties, the Qing dynasty, actually wasn't even ruled by ethnic Chinese. You might remember that there was a group of people that took over China, Now, this had happened earlier when the Mongols took over China, but again, a second time, another group of people took over China, and they wanted to make sure that they were accepted as Chinese. And they thought, you know what, if we bring back this really Chinese testing system, this would be a really good way for people to accept us. And that group of people were called the Manchu. The Manchu wanted to be accepted as Chinese, Manchu. Now, letter B, we go to the Ottoman Empire, and they had a very different way of centralizing control, of creating a bureaucracy, creating government workers, and that was through a system called the Dev-Shirmi. And that Dev-Shirmi is this system where we are recruiting workers from mainly Christian villages. The Dev-Shirmi is spelled Devshirme. And we want to basically go to these Christian villages and take kids when they're like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And this is a form of slavery. And the thing about this form of slavery is that it is not as terrible as other forms of slavery, but of course, all types of slavery are terrible, because some people were actually able to become educated. Some of these highly intelligent people were actually educated as slaves, and then they become like tax collectors and workers, things like that. And if you weren't like super intelligent, like you're going to be like a great tax collector or administrator, let's say your gifting was a little bit different. Maybe you're going to be really great with weapons. You're very good tactically. You're able to think through problems of warfare. You can become one of the elite soldiers. Those elite soldiers, those people became what we call janissaries. We call them janissaries. So we've talked about that. Letter C, West Africa. Broadly, West Africa embraces the use of religion to kind of like get everyone on the same page. And the religion that goes with West Africa always and forever is going to be Islam. Letter D, the Mughal Empire also, there's a vocabulary word that we should be familiar with for the Mughal Empire. And they had tax collectors called zamindars. They had tax collectors called zamindars. And this was a vocabulary word that we've used before and that we have familiarized ourselves with if you've read the PDF packet. Letter E, the Ottomans had a group of people called tax farmers, and these were people that could collect over and beyond the government's goal. They could collect taxes over and beyond the government goal. And so what I mean by that, if you're a tax farmer, you have all kinds of different types of farmers, but if you're a tax farmer, your job is to basically go around the empire collecting money. And the empire would give you like a number that say, hey, from this village, we need you to get 10,000 whatever of gold or whatever the case may be. And if you ask for 15,000 and you can collect it, you get to keep the extra. So tax farmers, you were the tax collectors for the empire and you got to collect whatever was extra. Letter F, what technology helped to gain these empires? What made the Ottomans and the Mughal and Safavids possible? A new technology called guns. And in addition to writing the simple word guns, I also want you to add a second thing for letter F. I want you to add what was the nickname of these empires, of the Ottoman, the Mughal, and the Safavid? Well, because guns were like a huge part of these empires, for letter F, make sure you also write gunpowder empires. So that's another name for these empires. They were called gunpowder empires. What else? Each empire had elite soldiers. How did they legitimize their power? A couple different ways. One way that these empires made their empires legitimate was letter A, through religion. In the Muslim world, there is a title that some of the leaders take that we've mentioned before, and the title is the word caliph. Now, the word caliph, it means that if you are the ruler, you're not calling yourself the king, you are the caliph. And that means actually that you are part of this unbroken chain of authority going from you back generation after generation after generation to the man who started the Muslim community, and that would be to the Prophet Muhammad. So the title caliph ties you to the Prophet Muhammad. And that way, if you claim to be the caliph, you're not just saying that you deserve to rule because it's your family name. You deserve to rule because you have the power of guns. You deserve to rule because you're part of this chain of authority going back to Muhammad. Religion makes my rule legitimate. In Europe, they also use religion to make their rule legitimate. You might remember in Europe, they believed that religion says that God placed the king on the throne and only he has the right to be on the throne. This is called the divine right of kings. And basically this says if God was put on the throne, if the king was put on the throne by God, then really only God has the authority to move him, and your job is to really just be loyal to him. Now, this can be resisted, and especially there's a country that resists this whole perspective, and that country that resists that perspective is England. And we mentioned in class that they resist that perspective of divine right of kings. They still believe in it, but they are going to limit what that means in two different ways. One is through a document called the Magna Carta, and the second one is through an institution called Parliament. We mentioned that both of these are things that limit the power of the king. Number three, another way to legitimize power is in West Africa. We mentioned this before. You might remember that one of the new rulers of the Songhai, that he decided to go ahead and take a trip to the most important place you could take a trip to, and that was to perform Hajj and go to Mecca. And that's a big deal, you know. That kind of shows you're a legitimate Muslim, you're a serious Muslim, and so West Africa uses Islam. But even though religion can unite and to bring legitimacy, it can also split regions like it did in the 1500s. And the most important example of religion splitting people up in the 1500s in Europe is what we call the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation. And religion can be used to even consolidate political control, that politicians, kings, can use religion to make themselves more powerful. One of the best examples of this is in England, where the king separated from Rome. You might remember that the king couldn't have a male heir, and it was so frustrating. He wanted permission to have a new marriage. The Catholic Church did not grant him permission, so he asked the Pope to work with him. The Pope refused, and so this king said, fine, I'm going to break with the Catholic Church. This king's name was Henry VIII. So he is technically a Protestant, but he doesn't break with Rome for deep-seated religious reasons. He breaks with Rome for political reasons. You also might remember that he has a daughter who takes the church back to the Catholic faith when he dies. But he has a second daughter because the first daughter only lived 5 years and then died of stomach cancer. And this daughter finalized the break with Rome. Her name, of course, is Elizabeth, one of the most important rulers of all of England. We also know that, of course, there's three types of branches of Protestantism. There was Lutheranism, there was Calvinism, and this third branch is the branch we're going to write down. This is the branch that we find in England, which is why actually this branch is sometimes called the Church of England, but the word we're going to use here is the word Anglicanism. The word Anglicanism. We also saw the role of religion in politics with something called the Peace of Augsburg. In the movie Luther we saw in the last scene, there was these princes and Charles V, he said, hey guys, you're going to be Catholic and stop reading the Bible in German. And they said, no, we'd rather you kill us than allow us that to happen. And he realizes he can't do that. He realizes he can't kill the princes of this country. And so he grants what's called the Peace of Augsburg. And it really limited the power of the Holy Roman Empire. You might remember the Holy Roman Empire was the name of Germany at this time. And this Peace of Augsburg said that the Holy Roman Emperor can't force you into whatever religion he wants. He can't force you to stop reading the Bible. And in fact, that Peace of Augsburg said that each prince got to choose their own religion. They got to choose their own religion. Letter V is religious conflict in the Muslim world. Just like Protestants, the Christian world split in Western Europe between Catholics and Protestants, the Muslim world has not been a stranger to split. In fact, you might remember the most famous conflict in the Muslim world is between Shias and Sunnis. Shias and Sunnis. So I can use bureaucracy to legitimize centralized power. I can use religion to legitimize myself. I can also use art. In fact, it says on your handout that the Qing, that's China, paid artists to create portraits of officials. In other words, they picked like the best artists in China to make sure that the paintings and the representations of the king made them look noble, made them look powerful. It presented them in the best possible light. So you can have art as kind of a piece of propaganda. And we even see European artists hired to work in one of the most famous churches in Rome. You might remember that this was supposed to be the headquarters of the Catholic Church. Remember, they sold indulgences to pay for it. This most important church in St. Peter's that had European Renaissance masters work in it was called St. Peter's. Finally, for letter C, I can legitimize my rule by building big fancy stuff, like monumental architecture. And one of the examples we had was from Shah Jahan. And Shah Jahan was the ruler of the Mughal Empire in India. And one of the things he did is that he loved his wife. And he loved his wife so much that upon her death and producing it through their marriage 14 children together, he wanted to honor her and built a luxurious tomb for her called the Taj Mahal. That building, the Taj Mahal, is this incredible structure. And because that's not a palace, it's not a place of worship, it's not a place where people live, it sends a message. It sends a message that the ruler is great, the ruler is powerful. It's a symbol of his authority. Speaking of symbols of authority, we have Louis XIV. You might remember he built something as a symbol of his authority, claiming to be the Sun King, wanting all of France to revolve around him. He built the palace outside of Paris called Versailles, and that becomes the palace of all palaces, the thing that all people looked for. And why does he build Versailles? Well, he wants to keep track of, you'll write down the nobility. You might remember there's this idea of keeping your friends close, your enemies closer. Versailles becomes a place of political distraction where you're just going to have parties and eat and drink and have a good time. The last example of control, we said that you can control your empire through bureaucracy. We said that you can control your empire through technology like guns. We said you can legitimize your empire through religion. You could also legitimize it through art, and you can also legitimize through monumental architecture. The last example of monumental architecture is Peter the Great doing something, actually moving the capital from Moscow to this city on the Baltic Sea. He moved and made a brand new capital modeled after France. That city is called St. Petersburg. With that, we are wrapped up with our first review. We will be doing another one on Monday, and on Tuesday, we'll go ahead and take a test. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you guys next time.